Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We're talking about typewriters, journalism, and the Second World War today. But before we dive into that, I need you to engage with me on an imaginary exercise. One piece of that is not hard to imagine. So let's put ourselves in, 1940, right? There's no internet. There's no social media. And they've got word of mouth. You got the newspaper, and you got the radio, which is still sort of in its infancy a little bit. And you might have some regular news updates that you get from the movie theater, the cinema, if you will, but that's it, right? You can't get on your phone and say, hey, what's up in anywhere in the world? It doesn't exist. So you got to think of yourself in an insulated environment, right? We're in Roswell. We may not know what's going on in Alpharetta. We may not know what's going on where I grew up. You may not know what's going on in Atlanta. The best you got is word of mouth from your networks, right? So I want you to think about all of that before we get into this this morning, or this afternoon rather. It's 2 o'clock. So this is a picture from Lee Miller, who was a very famous female war correspondent. She was one who basically someone would say, no, you can't go, and she would go anyway, right? It's one of the very first ceiling breakers, if you will, in female journalism. This is a photo that she took in 1940 following a blitz in London, which was the German bombing of London during that period. And the title of this photo is called Remington Silent. It's a juxtaposition, right? Remington and Underwood both made a noiseless machine, right? That doesn't make a lot of noise, obviously. It doesn't, the type bars don't strike the plat, and there's a string that pulls the mechanism down, and then it kind of, hits from an angle, if you will. So that's what you've got pictured here is a Remington Silent. But obviously this Remington is going to be silent, probably indefinitely, because the key components are all over the place, right? So these are the kind of images that you would see for the first time. She also was famous for taking photos of things that were controversial at the time, right? Those are the photos that we see, not, people from a distance or things like that. She's up in your face. And I also found out this morning, and I'm not paid by any film industry companies, right? I promise. There's a film that Kate Winslet was in that was released in September of last year called Lee, which it talks about more in depth of Lee Miller's story. So this is who I am, right? You'll recognize at least two of the people in here. So I'm a freelance news writer, typewriter enthusiast, amateur historian, part of the Atlanta Typewriter Club. I'm a husband and a father. I have a bachelor's in political science and a master's in public administration from West Georgia. My undergrad work was done at LaGrange College, not that that matters. What I mean by the golden age is you have the perfect intersection of radio, newsprint, and the early stages of television, right? It's the golden age. Everybody's dialed in to those two sources. That's all you got. There's nothing else. And so what you have during this period is not only a proliferation of newspaper readers, but you've got a proliferation of correspondence as well. You got people going to the Pacific, people in North Africa, you got people in the Atlantic rather. You got people all over the place, right? This is the first time where somebody departs Chicago, New York, and they're like, okay, I'm going where I'm going. And an example of that will be Ernie Pyle, right? Ernie Pyle is in Europe, he's in North Africa, he's in the Pacific, and unfortunately dies in the Pacific. We'll talk about him in a little bit. But that's what you got. This is where the perfect story meets the perfect skills as those exist. Standards and objectivity. So let's think about this. So I think we're all here old enough to remember the Vietnam War, right? We all remember press coverage of the Vietnam War. So there's a juxtaposition that exists between the way that World War II was covered and the way that Vietnam was covered. During this period, most of the coverage that you read in the U.S. from CBS, NBC, New York Times, any of the local papers that you see were extremely hesitant to show American forces in an adverse way. They generally didn't show pictures of American dead. They wouldn't show them maimed. You wouldn't see that kind of stuff, right? Because the press at that point had an agreement with the Roosevelt administration that, we're going to try to present this in a positive light. There's a book, I believe it's called White House Looks South, where it talks about the press not covering Roosevelt sitting in a wheelchair. And that kind of extends into this conflict, right? So that's where the difference in objectivity. In the Vietnam War, you don't see that, right? We always, we're all old enough now to know about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars too, right? Iraq was the war where we heard the embedded journalist, right? You got whoever from CNN, Fox, there was somebody from ABC who got severely injured. All that stuff happened here for the first time. In World War I, you had a correspondent who might write a story, but he's 15 miles or she's 15 miles behind enemy lines. There are no firsthand accounts. They're writing a story off whatever the command poster says, something that's very filtered, it's been censored, and it's a soft explanation about what's going on. In some instances, you didn't see that here, but in some instances, you did. Right? Ernie Pyle was someone who told the story of the individual soldier. Right? Other places, Associated Press, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, you might see from a large scale what the battle tactics are, right? So that's your press agreements technology. All right. So let me move your eyes over here. So you got some Remingtons, Royals, and an Underwood, right? These probably 35 pounds. And for the first time, you have something that looks like this, right? I can't do that with that Remington. At least I'm not going to try because somebody's going to laugh. But that's what you have. You have a proliferation of portable, ultra-portable typewriters, right? So you've got that. Also, you've got the ability to write a story, transmit it wirelessly. If you have photos, the photos have to be flown somewhere. And then these words can be read within a couple of days. Radio broadcasts, matter of hours, sometimes real time. But with the print of this, generally you can read within 2 days of what's happened somewhere, if not sooner. So those are some of the changes that you have with technology. If you dig back in the archives, like if you look in the New York Times archives, you'll see something that says by wireless, right? It won't have the person's name because they're trying to protect anonymity in the field, but it'll say by wireless. And if you look on most of the old newspapers from this period, that's what you'll see. All right, so over here on the left, and this is just a clip of where this came from. So for all of the sources that I've used are readily accessible, right? I'm a patron of the Cobb County Library System. So all the sources either came from something I obtained from there, Federal Archives, or from my own collection. So this is a huddling of war correspondence on Iwo Jima. If you see the Hermes baby that's pictured here, that's the exact same model that's pictured right here. We talked earlier about portability, right? Portability is in the eye of the beholder. Because for any typewriter collector, right, you'll be told, oh, this is portable. Well, is a 30-pound machine in a case portable? I mean, yeah, sure, why not? But you have something that's as little as 8 pounds. And if I'm going to present a story, I want this little thing, not one of these big guys. These are some of the models most commonly used. You've got Remingtons, you've got Hermes, you've got Royals, you've got Underwoods. 3 of these are American made. Hermes comes from Switzerland, I think that's right. But that's what you've got, right? You've got portable machines, you've got ultra portables. If you imagine, anyone who had the first or second generation of laptops, they're in a bag, they're heavy, but it's better than carrying a desktop around. So what were they used for? Same thing that you use your laptop now for, you use your email for, correspondence, memos, dispatches, orders, all that good stuff. You might draft a copy of something and send it out. Tom Reckhoff has a book somewhere floating around that's a capture of, I think it's the 7th U.S. Army in Europe. So if you look through that book, everything that you see in that was generated on something that's similar to one of these. All right, so it's showtime, right? So I'm going to show you 2 clips. This one is from the Marshall Islands, and this one's from the Philippine Islands. It should be in perfect order, and you'll see this guy on this side is someone from the Associated Press writing a story about the Marshall Islands campaign, and he's using the royal that's in the middle. Most of the royals created during this period, it could be an Arrow, it could be a Quiet Deluxe, it could be an Aristocrat, it could be any numbers of those. Some are made in the US, some are made in Canada, but they're mechanically largely the same machine. Is that playing? Perfect. Everybody can see that, right? Okay. All right, over here on the right, we've got a crew from the Philippine Islands campaign. And if you look closely, that guy's using a Remington Rand number 5 that's like this one, but his has a matte coating on it so that doesn't attract every scratch you could ever imagine. That's how these things are used, right? You're sitting in a trench, foxhole, leaning on the side of a ship, whatever it might be, and you're writing back home to tell folks what's up. So let's talk about some of the key players that you'll see in some of the stories that you dig back into. So number 1 is Ernie Pyle, right? Everybody knows who Ernie Pyle is? Okay. So he's someone who really for kind of the first time is writing about the individual soldier. He writes a story about troops fighting on a chocolate diet in the Pacific because their resupply's been shut off. He writes about troops all over the place. He writes about the ordinary people, right? And he writes in a conversational, empathetic tone, right? You're talking about people's feet who are split apart because they've had to march for so long, may not have been home in a couple of years, mail might be cut off, resupply might be cut off, right? And really is telling the story of the individual soldier back home about what the struggle is, right? What is the fight really about? Number 2 here is Sigrid Schultz. And she actually was in Germany prior to the start of the war, right? So I think she first lands in Germany in 1922, 23. So she's there for the challenges of the Weimar Republic, if you're well versed in that, right? The hyperinflation, where money is basically worthless. She also speaks German very fluently. So she's someone who's able to get into places that American correspondents can't get to. So she talks to Hitler, to Goering, all those key figures that are in the German government, and really kind of signaled to the U.S. back home there's about to be a conflict here. And the Nazis are a highly risky government. Things are about to change. And when it does, you better be ready, right? She's the one who gives us the warning, whistleblower, if you will. She's really interesting character. Morrow, right? Everybody knows Edward Morrow. Anybody knows Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare, all that good stuff. So Morrow is someone who comes to prominence during the Blitz. He's a CBS radio correspondent, broadcaster. He's on top of a building somewhere off in the distance getting bombed, and you get to hear his live take of that. There's a film, Live from Baghdad, I think, that talks about a couple of CNN correspondents. Bernard Shaw's in that, and Peter Arnett, and they're talking about, American Air Force bombing Baghdad. That's kind of where Edward Morrow is, right? He's telling you the story as it comes down. He's got a crew called the Murrow Boys. William Shirer is in that group as well. who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which is basically his firsthand account of what's going on. Martha Gellhorn. Anybody know Ernest Hemingway? Okay. Martha is married to Ernest Hemingway, and he incredibly detests the fact that she wants to be a war correspondent, right? And he sends her a telegram, either a telegram or phone call, I don't recall in my research, that says, "Are you a war correspondent, or are you my wife in bed?" That's the juxtaposition of how he sees her, right? But Martha goes where no one else wants to go, right? I believe that she was one of the first females to be accredited by the military as a war correspondent. But when everybody else, when Hemingway and his crew are entering the bar in Paris after liberation, she's with the frontline troops still writing the story. On June 6th, on D-Day, right? Hemingway and his crew and a bunch of other correspondents are off in the distance, chilling in a landing craft, watching what's going on from a distance. But she snuck on to a hospital ship, hid in the bathroom, and as soon as the invasion is made, troops are injured, they're brought back onto the ship. She's loading bodies on and off, transporting bodies, and writing the story firsthand of what she sees, right? That's what you've got here. And so she is someone who would go anywhere and everywhere, would sleep in a trench, get injured, didn't matter. There was no story that she wouldn't run from. Richard Tregaskis, Guadalcanal, Battle of Guadalcanal, he's the one who wrote the book, which is firsthand account, which is some of my great-grandfather was at Guadalcanal, some of the absolute nastiest fighting that you will ever see. It's raining, there's feet of mud, there's insects. At one point, Guadalcanal gets cut off from American resupply. Troops are living on nothing. And it really is the first time that American ground troops are fighting back, right? On the ground, they're fighting back. They're saying, this is, what is the famous quote from Admiral Yamamoto? Something about awaken a sleeping giant. He told that story. All right. And then we've got Elizabeth Murphy Moss. She was a correspondent, she came from Baltimore, and she's the first black female war correspondent to be certified by the U.S. government, U.S. military. And she was ready to roll. She got to London in 1944, right? Had written some stories about the struggles of black soldiers. This is before the executive order during the Korean War, just before the Korean War started, from Truman to integrate the military. So you still have a very segregated press corps, a very segregated military. And she's someone who broke that barrier, but in London in 1944, she gets sick, she's ill, she can't go to Europe and report, and has to unfortunately come back home and not fill in the gaps on the struggles of black soldiers. Still wrote the stories, just wasn't able to do it from first-hand accounts in Europe. All right, so let's talk about storytelling, right? You all had grandparents who say, well, back in my day, we walked both hills up way in the snow, it was 12 degrees. Okay. And so let's think back to that imaginary exercise from earlier where there's no internet, there's no TV, there's nothing, right? It's your community, it's your radio, and your newspaper. That's all you got. So the view of the war is shaped specifically by what's read in the paper. And if you're reading something every single day that's dogging and it's beating down on the war effort and it's saying that it's useless, and if that's all that you got, that's what the public opinion is going to be. But that wasn't the case. As I spoke about earlier, the agreement with the press and the U.S. government was to cover the war in a positive light. and that largely shapes what the public opinion is going to be. You've got the human element to those back home, right? You might have a loved one you haven't seen in a couple of years. There's an old Underwood's a typewriter that's on the end over there. There's an old Underwood ad where they're making M2 carbine rifles, right? The little small carbines, and Underwood, Corona made rifles. All the typewriter companies made rifles. And in that ad, the lady who is the laborer now is talking about she hasn't seen her husband in 2 years, but she hopes that every rifle that she makes helps him come home faster. Those are the kinds of things that you're providing the human element to those back home, and it created the standard for future war reporting, right? That's what we're talking about. The embedded journalist. That's where this starts. So that's what we got. So we want to know what's up. We got to know it now. This is a masthead from New York Times that talks about the landings on D-Day. So imagine if you saw this, June 7th, 1944. Powerful event in history, right? We look back at it now, but imagine if you had seen that for the first time, right? That's what you got. This is a quote from Jack Stenbuck, who's wrote the book up here about Typewriter Battalion. And it says, "Never in all history had the drama of war been painted as visually and completely at the very moment it was unfolding as in World War II." Right? We think about now, breaking news, hey, this happened. There was a Georgia senator who got arrested trying to go into the Georgia House a couple of days ago from Northwest Georgia, I think he said, 200,000 or whatever he said. Right? We knew about that within, AJC had that update out within a minute or two, right? That kind of story in the past, it might be a couple of days before that happens, but now news is almost moot by the time that you see it, right? If you still get a print paper, by the time that it's in the driveway and the time that you read it, it's old news at that point. That didn't necessarily exist in this period. So that's the quote that I want you to walk away with.